Hey guys, tonight we wander into the warm, nostalgic glow of bedtime, the hush before sleep, the moment you pull the blanket close and wait for a story that feels safe. You know the kind. Castles glinting under moonlight, talking animals with impeccable manners, princesses who somehow always wake up beautiful. But here's the twist. Those gentle stories you grew up with weren't always gentle. Some were survival manuals for a cruel world. Some were warnings wrapped in rhyme. And a few were never meant for children at all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a candlelit room, the kind that smells faintly of beeswax and burnt sugar. The walls are lined with thick old books, spines cracked, pages yellowed like forgotten teeth. The air feels ancient, humming softly with stories that have been told, retold and scrubbed clean for modern ears. You open one book, and the title whispers something that sounds familiar. Once upon a time. Except this time wasn't a dreamy past. It was rough, muddy, hungry. Fairy tales began not as bedtime stories, but as fireside survival guides told by peasants who had no bedtime to begin with. Life was short, food was scarce, and justice came in the form of wolves, witches, or worse. The once in once upon a time meant when the world was cruel and no one was safe. You flip another page and find yourself in the 1600s, when storytelling was a kind of weapon. Peasants used tales to mock kings. Women used them to warn daughters, and travelers swapped them like gossip. One mainstream historical fact: long before Disney, tales like Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty circulated orally across Europe, recorded later by collectors like Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. They were never children's literature. They were adult cautionary codes. Take The Juniper Tree, for example, a lesser-known German folktale. In it, a stepmother decapitates her stepson, hides the head under an apple tree, and feeds his remains to the unsuspecting father. Later, the boy's spirit returns as a bird to avenge himself. Sweet dreams, right? This was the kind of story whispered before bed, a lullaby made of bones. Historians still argue whether these tales were meant to moralize or merely mirror reality. Did they teach obedience, or did they allow the oppressed to speak their fear aloud? A quirky tidbit. In some rural French villages, storytellers were paid in bread, wine, or even butter. So when they said a tale was buttery smooth, they meant it literally. The darkness wasn't an accident. It was the point. Imagine being a mother in a thatched cottage, your husband gone to war, the woods outside thick with wolves and whispers. You tell your children about witches who eat the careless and princes who punish the proud, not because you want to scare them, but because fear is a kind of armor. And the kids, they didn't hide under the covers. They leaned in. They knew life was scary already. These stories didn't frighten them. They prepared them. That's the irony of bedtime tales. The darker they were, the safer they made listeners feel. A story with a monster you can name is better than a silence that hides one. You wander deeper into this room of paper ghosts, and the shadows of your favorite fairy tale characters start to twitch. Little Red Riding Hood looks older now, her red hood frayed and stained. Snow White's lips are pale, not rosy. Even Pinocchio's grin seems splintered. It's like you've caught them off duty, their happy endings peeled away. You pause beside a cracked mirror. Every good story has one. Your reflection stares back, flickering between then and now. You realize bedtime stories were society's therapy sessions before Freud existed. People dumped their nightmares into tales and decorated them with talking animals so no one would panic. The wolf wasn't just a wolf. It was famine, or lust, or the tax collector. The witch wasn't just evil. She was the midwife, the healer, the woman who knew too much. There's a soft laugh behind you, the kind you can't tell is kind or cruel. Maybe it's a storyteller, invisible but amused. You think about how each story promised safety after suffering. Good girls sleep, bad girls bleed, brave boys live, foolish ones get cooked. The moral math was brutal, but it made sense to a world where fairness was fiction. Another mainstream truth. By the 18th century, the French court under Louis XIV had turned storytelling into a fashion statement. Aristocrats competed to tell the most elegant version of peasant nightmares. That's how Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella entered high society, perfumed and powdered, but still carrying traces of their blood-soaked origins. And here's a fun, unsettling fact. Some original versions of Sleeping Beauty included not one, but two attempted assaults, while the princess was unconscious. Historians still argue whether those versions were cautionary metaphors or just grim reflections of power dynamics in patriarchal Europe. Either way, the lesson wasn't, wait for your prince. It was, never fall asleep when the world belongs to men like him. You shiver. The air in the room grows colder, as if the stories themselves resent being exposed. Maybe they preferred their sugar coating, but you keep reading, tracing your finger over ink that looks suspiciously like dried tears. If bedtime stories were medicine, then modern versions are candy. Sweet, shiny, easy to swallow. But you know there's something missing. That bitter truth underneath. The part that said, don't go into the woods. The part that said, you probably won't survive this. Your candle flickers. Somewhere a lullaby hums in an old tongue. You can't tell if it's comforting or cursed. You close the book, but the echo of those tales stays in your head like the aftertaste of a strange dream. You realize you've just walked through the first doorway, the gentle threshold between the fairy tales you thought you knew and the reality you were never told. Tomorrow night, you'll step into the next chamber, grim territory, where two brothers took Europe's wildest nightmares and decided they needed editing. The candle dims, the whisper fades. The book breathes once, then sleeps. You find yourself walking down a cobblestone path that smells of rain and ink, somewhere in early 19th century Germany. The air tastes of chimney smoke and boiled potatoes. A church bell tolls in the distance, and every sound feels slightly muffled, as if history itself has cotton in its ears. Two men stand by a window inside a small, dim study. The brothers Grimm. Jacob is hunched over a pile of papers, muttering in Latin. Wilhelm dips his quill in ink, his face pale and thin from too many sleepless nights. You're not looking at Disney dreamers here. You're watching data collectors, language obsessives, and accidental myth curators. These weren't bedtime storytellers. They were scholars chasing a dying Germany through its dialects. You hover closer. The desk is cluttered with old letters, church records, and notes from peasants who'd been promised a coin for their tales. Some of those informants were farm wives, some soldiers' widows, and a few, oddly enough, were middle-class women who'd learned the stories from their servants. The Grimms weren't inventing fairy tales. They were cleaning them. One mainstream historical fact. Their first major book, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children's and Household Tales, published in 1812, was never intended for children. It was a linguistic project, an archive of German oral culture during a time when Napoleon's occupation was erasing regional identities. But publishers noticed that the darker, bloodier stories didn't sell well to parents. So the brothers, ever the pragmatists, began polishing the horror into something a little more marketable. You glance at their drafts. There's a penciled note beside Hansel and Gretel. Mother changed to stepmother. It's a small edit with a giant echo. Across the manuscript, Mother becomes stepmother again and again. Snow White, Cinderella, Rapunzel. Why? Because a mother killing or abandoning her child was too horrifying for polite society. Easier to blame an outsider, a step something. Historians still argue whether this was moral censorship or just social survival. The Grimms trying to protect women's image, or to protect book sales. You can almost hear Wilhelm sighing as he smooths a paragraph. Let's make her fall asleep instead of die. There it is, the origin of the modern happy ending. A nap instead of a death. A prince instead of oblivion. Outside their window, Germany is poor, fragmented, and filled with superstition. Villagers still hang iron scissors above cradles to ward off fairies. Bread crusts are tossed into rivers for the spirits. When people say a child was taken, they don't mean kidnapped. They mean the elves came. Fairy tales, at their core, were rural news reports told in metaphor. The Grimms just formalized them into print. You pick up a scrap of paper from their floor. It's an early draft of the juniper tree again. Only this time, the violence is intact. The child's head is chopped off, his blood mingling with the mother's tears. Wilhelm hesitates, then writes, and yet she was forgiven. Even he knew forgiveness sold better than justice. Here's a quirky tidbit. Jacob Grimm was so fascinated by etymology that he discovered Grimm's Law, a linguistic pattern showing how consonant sounds shifted through languages. Imagine finding a mathematical formula inside bedtime stories. He believed every folktale was like a fossil. Dig deep enough, and you'd find the bones of humanity's first language. But the deeper they dug, the more disturbing it got. Many of the Grimm tales were about starvation, abuse, or divine punishment, and yet they dressed them in rhythm and rhyme so they'd travel easily by mouth. It's like coating poison with sugar. That's the genius and danger of storytelling. You move closer to the hearth, where a kettle murmurs on low flame. A group of children sits cross-legged waiting for a story. The eldest woman in the room, gray-haired, shawl pulled tight, begins reciting Rumpelstiltskin. Her voice is low, her accent thick. You notice she changes small things every time. Sometimes the imp tears himself in half. Sometimes he just vanishes in smoke. Oral tradition was never about accuracy. It was about rhythm. That's what the Grimms froze. Living stories turned into literary taxidermy. Historians still argue whether they saved folklore or killed it by trapping it in ink. After all, a story that can't breathe changes nothing. But the world wanted their version. By 1857, the Grimm's tales had been translated across Europe. The violence remained, but now it came with morals attached. Good girls obey. Bad ones dance to death in red-hot shoes. You lean against the cold stone wall, listening to Jacob mumble about purity of German spirit. That phrase sends a chill through you, not just because of what it meant then, but what it would later echo in darker chapters of German history. Stories, like language, are never neutral. They carry the DNA of the culture that tells them. There's another strange note in Wilhelm's handwriting. Children should be frightened, but safely. You smirk. That's basically every parent's bedtime philosophy since forever. The trick was to dose fear like medicine, enough to inoculate, not enough to scar. You step outside into the German dusk. The town smells of coal and cabbage. Somewhere, a church choir hums a lullaby about heaven's garden. You realize how those songs and stories wove together, religion and folklore, sin and spell. When the Grimms edited their tales, they weren't just chasing purity of language. They were reshaping morality for a new middle class that wanted faith and comfort. A rooster crows, too early or too late, and you wonder if maybe the tales edited themselves through time. Each generation trimming off what it couldn't bear. Each mother deciding which horror her children could handle. Maybe that's why we keep calling them children's stories. Not because they were made for kids, but because kids were the only ones brave enough to hear them without flinching. As the night deepens, you notice the cobblestones glimmer faintly. Maybe it's dew. Maybe it's the ghosts of old storytellers stepping lightly across centuries. You can almost hear their laughter, rough and tired but proud. You think we wrote about magic? No, we wrote about you. The last image you see is Wilhelm closing his book, whispering, "And they lived happily ever after," like an apology he doesn't quite believe. You turn away, still hearing the scratch of their quills, the rewriting of fear into fable. Ahead waits a sleeping girl in a tower. The next story they'll sanitize. And you, foolish dreamer, are already walking toward her. You wake to the creak of a spindle turning slowly in the dark. The air smells of iron, dust, and wilted roses. A tower looms before you, narrow, cold, and endless. Somewhere above, a girl sleeps, her chest rising and falling like the ticking of a clock that forgot how to stop. You already know her name, but not her truth. Sleeping Beauty. Such a tender phrase, isn't it? Makes you think of peace and purity, a gentle nap sealed with a kiss. But that's not what she was in the beginning. Her real story comes from much older roots, tangled in the myths of ancient Europe, where women didn't nap. They were cursed to stillness. You walk through the centuries like through layers of cobwebs. First, there's the Italian version, recorded long before the Brothers Grimm ever picked up a pen. Sun, Moon, and Talia, from Giambattista Basile's Pentamerone in 1634. It's not about romance, it's about violation. A sleeping woman, trapped in her body, gives birth to twins after being assaulted by a passing king. When she wakes, it's not love that greets her, it's confusion and shame. So much for true love's kiss. One mainstream historical fact: Basile's Sleeping Beauty is considered the first literary version of the tale, predating Perrault and the Grimms. And yes, in that early story, there's no spinning wheel to prick a finger. Instead, it's a sliver of flax, something practical, domestic, ordinary, that pierces her skin and seals her fate. Domestic life itself was the danger. You climb the staircase inside the tower, your hand grazing the cold stone. You imagine the women who told this story by firelight, mothers, midwives, spinners, warning daughters not to drift into stillness, not to let men's promises make them sleep through their own lives. Historians still argue whether the sleeping curse was symbolic, a metaphor for arranged marriages, childbearing, or simply the long pause between girlhood and awakening into a world run by men. You reach the chamber door. It groans open, revealing a girl on a bed draped in faded velvet. Her hair is tangled with cobwebs, and her lips are dry from centuries of silence. You whisper, "Wake up," but of course she doesn't. She's not meant to. Not yet. A quirky tidbit. In some regional versions from Scandinavia, Sleeping Beauty's body is moved from place to place like a sacred relic. Villagers believed that her slumber could bless crops or heal infertility. She wasn't just a princess, she was a kind of miracle statue, a divine sleeper whose stillness kept chaos at bay. The tale was less about romance and more about ritual. But then came Charles Perrault in the late 1600s, France's literary gentleman with a wig too white to trust. He softened the story, swapped assault for enchantment, and dressed the horror in silk. His version ends with a polite marriage. But even that wasn't enough for Victorian sensibilities 2 centuries later. They needed the prince's kiss to look romantic. And so it did. A small rewrite, a big deception. You glance around the room. The air hums with a strange sweetness, like sugar burned too long. Somewhere, the spinning wheel lies broken, its needle glinting faintly in the candlelight. You touch it. It pricks your skin, and for a moment, everything stops. Time folds. You see Sleeping Beauty not as a girl, but as an idea, the ideal woman of her era. Beautiful, patient, passive. She doesn't eat, doesn't age, doesn't protest. She just waits. And what is waiting really, if not a polite kind of dying? The wind through the cracked window sounds like distant voices. Women through time whispering the same warning. Don't fall asleep too early. Don't let the world decide when you wake. A gentle laugh escapes you. You think of modern retellings, animated, pastel, kissed awake by a man who's barely met her. The audience sighs, the music swells, and no one questions why she had to sleep at all. The darkness was edited out, but the message stayed. Stillness equals virtue. Awakening equals reward. Another mainstream fact. When Walt Disney released Sleeping Beauty in 1959, he based the animation on a blend of Perrault's version and the ballet by Tchaikovsky. The art was stunning, the orchestration majestic, but the message remained sugar-coated obedience. Even Aurora's name, meaning dawn, was ironic, because she spent most of her life unconscious. You wander to the window. Outside, the forest stretches endlessly, thorny, wild, ancient. You remember that in early folklore, thorns weren't decoration. They were punishment. They grew over her castle because of neglect, because no one deserved to reach her yet. In some tellings, the brambles impale suitors who try to enter before the destined hour. Waiting becomes a kind of divine vengeance. Historians still argue whether this sleep was a curse against the woman or for her, a divine pause saving her from a world too cruel. Some feminist scholars see her as the first protester, refusing to participate in a rigged system. Others see tragedy, a woman robbed of agency until kissed into usefulness. Either way, you realize she didn't choose to sleep, but she didn't choose to wake either. You look at her one last time. Her lashes flutter. Maybe it's the breeze, maybe a trick of light. For a moment, you imagine what would happen if she never woke. If the story ended right here, no prince, no wedding, just eternal rest. It wouldn't be romantic, but it might finally be fair. A faint chuckle drifts from the shadows. Maybe it's the witch who cursed her, smug that her magic worked longer than expected. In the older tales, the witch isn't always evil. Sometimes she's wise, even merciful. After all, she gives the girl sleep, not death. A pause, not a punishment. You step away, heart heavy, but awake. The air outside the tower feels sharper now, the night less forgiving. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint chime of another story stirring. The sound of cinders shifting in a fireplace. Someone's waiting at the hearth, covered in ash, dreaming of escape. You follow the trail of smoke to a cottage that smells of soot, onions, and old magic. The floor is blackened, not by accident, but by habit. Ash clings to the walls like memory, and in the middle of it all, you see her, Cinderella. Not the glowing Disney vision with fluttering birds and sparkly shoes, but a girl with calloused hands and eyes that never stop scanning the door. She's kneeling by the fire, scraping at the hearth with a piece of broken pottery. You notice her fingers are red from scrubbing, and there's a strange calm to it, like she's used to pain. You've arrived in the true story's kitchen, not the ballroom. And it's far from a fairy tale. The earliest known versions of Cinderella come from all over the world: China, Egypt, Greece. But the one that most Westerners know began as Aschenputtel in the Brothers Grimm collection. Ashfool. The name alone tells you what she was to her family: a living joke, a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. One mainstream historical fact. In the Grimm version, there's no fairy godmother. No pumpkin, no wand, no glass slipper. Cinderella's magic comes from a hazel tree she plants on her mother's grave. She waters it with her tears until a white bird appears to grant her wishes. It's not glamour, it's grief made visible. The air thickens as you watch her whisper to the ashes, her voice trembling like a spark ready to catch. Historians still argue whether the Grimm brothers softened her suffering or amplified it. The violence they did keep was strangely intimate. In their telling, when the prince comes looking for the girl who fits the slipper, the stepsisters slice off pieces of their own feet to make it fit. One cuts off her toes, another her heel. Blood seeps into the shoe, but the prince, brilliant man that he is, doesn't notice until a bird sings from a nearby tree. There's blood in the shoe. The true bride waits for you. A quirky tidbit. That singing bird wasn't random. It was probably inspired by old European folk customs where birds acted as spirit messengers, revealing truth or guilt. The Grimm brothers adored such imagery. They saw animals as divine referees, which means in this version, justice doesn't come from royalty. It comes from nature itself. You glance toward the hazel tree outside, its branches glistening with dew and sorrow. Beneath it, bones rest quietly. In older oral versions, that tree wasn't just symbolic, it was the mother. The idea of a tree growing from a parent's grave appears in countless cultures, symbolizing that love, once buried, can still protect. You can't help smiling sadly at the thought. Cinderella never had magic dust. She had grief and persistence. She didn't wait for rescue. She built it leaf by leaf. But then came Perrault again, our ever-polite French courtier in the 17th century. He replaced the ghost mother with a godmother, traded birds for carriages, and introduced the glass slipper because it sounded elegant in French. The word verre means glass, but some scholars argue it might have originally been verre, meaning fur. Historians still argue whether Cinderella's shoe was glass or fur, fragile or animal. One symbolized purity, the other sensuality. Either way, it was never meant to be comfortable. You look around the small kitchen and realize that every detail, the ash, the chores, the cruelty, wasn't fiction. It was a reflection of real servant life in medieval Europe. Girls like her existed everywhere. They were orphans, debt servants, or daughters pushed out of inheritance. Ash girls were household fixtures, invisible but indispensable. She pauses for a moment, staring into the fire as if waiting for a voice to answer. And then you realize she's not dreaming of the prince. She's dreaming of freedom. Every happily ever after that came later was someone else's invention. The original story ends not with a dance, but with justice. At her wedding, 2 doves fly down and peck out her stepsister's eyes. Balance restored, Grimm style. Romantic? Not exactly. Satisfying? Absolutely. A faint smile crosses your face as you imagine telling that version to a child at bedtime. Sleep tight, sweetheart. Don't steal shoes that aren't yours. You hear movement behind you. The stepsisters stand in the doorway, their dresses fine but faces sharp with jealousy. They mutter something under their breath about luck and witchcraft. One kicks the bucket of ashes, scattering soot across the floor. Cinderella doesn't flinch. She just hums, a lullaby her mother once sang. The soot settles around her like a crown. Another mainstream historical fact. In 1893, folklorist Marion Roalf Cox cataloged over 300 global variations of the Cinderella story. In some African versions, the heroine's helper is a fish spirit. In Native American versions, her dress comes from the bones of an ancestor. Across continents, the theme stays the same: humiliation transformed into grace. The message isn't find a prince, but rise from what tried to bury you. Still, every generation rewrote her to fit its needs. The Victorians made her modest. Hollywood made her fashionable. Disney made her marketable. By the time she was done being cleaned up, even her ashes looked like glitter. You step outside for air. The moonlight hits the chimney smoke just right. And for a moment, it looks like the shape of a bird, the same one from the tree. It circles the roof once, then disappears into the night, leaving behind a faint whisper. Remember who the story was really for. You look back at Cinderella, still kneeling by the hearth, her face illuminated by fire. She's not fragile. She's forged. The slipper, the prince, the palace, they're afterthoughts. What she really wanted was a door that opened and never closed behind her again. Somewhere deep in the woods, a howl echoes, a warning or a welcome, you can't tell. But you know who's coming next. A girl in red, carrying bread and fear through the dark. The fire flickers, and Cinderella fades into smoke. The woods are waiting. You step carefully onto a forest path. The ground is damp, covered in leaves that smell like decay and moss, and the trees lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers pointing the way. Somewhere up ahead, a small figure in a red hood balances a basket of bread and cheese, her eyes wide with caution. You know her name. Little Red Riding Hood. Or at least, that's the polite version. The path itself feels alive, as if the forest remembers every footstep of every girl who has ever dared to enter it. In reality, the earliest versions of her story were far less charming. One mainstream historical fact. Charles Perrault's 1697 Le Petit Chaperon Rouge introduced the version where the wolf eats the grandmother and then the girl, leaving the ending grim, stark, and morally instructive. There was no heroic woodcutter. There was no second chance. You probably wouldn't survive this. You crouch behind a mossy tree and watch her navigate the winding trail. Her basket is heavy, not just with food, but with the anxiety of every adult who knows she will not make it unscathed. She treads carefully, balancing hope and fear. The wolf is never far, sometimes disguised as an animal, sometimes as hunger, sometimes as a metaphor for men who exploit trust. Historians still argue whether the wolf was meant to warn children about predators, famine, or the temptations of strangers. Likely all three. A quirky tidbit. In medieval Europe, bread was so valuable that stealing it could get you hanged. So Little Red's journey with a basket wasn't whimsical. It was dangerous. That loaf of bread represented survival itself. Losing it could be fatal. The girl approaches her grandmother's house, and the air grows heavier. You notice the shadows inside the window stretch unnaturally, shapes curling and bending like smoke. In early Italian versions, the wolf is not even an animal. It is a man who tricks the girl, turning her trust into vulnerability. The forest in these stories becomes a trap not just of trees, but of social expectation and gendered danger. You watch her knock. The door creaks open. The figure on the bed lies under a quilt, eyes dim and voice weak. She whispers, "Come closer, my child." You feel a chill. This isn't a nursery rhyme. It's a warning repeated across generations. Don't trust everyone, even if they seem familiar. Another mainstream fact. Brothers Grimm versions later softened Perrault's ending by introducing a hunter who saves both Red and her grandmother. But the original oral traditions of France, Italy, and Germany didn't include this happy rescue. Some versions have her outsmarting the wolf herself. Others end in her disappearance, leaving a cautionary tale rather than a triumphant one. The forest itself hums with menace, whispering through the leaves. You notice the wolf's eyes flicker in the shadows, hungry, clever, calculating. In some folklore, the wolf represents famine or plague. In others, a sexual predator. And sometimes the story blends both. The wolf is not always what you expect. Quirky tidbit number 2. In Provence, children sometimes wore red hoods or capes not for style, but for superstition. The color red was believed to protect them from evil spirits in the woods. Little Red Riding Hood's signature garment was as much armor as ornament. As she edges closer to the bed, you imagine the grandmother's voice. Tired from years of cooking, cleaning, and worrying about everything in the village. In some versions, she's a shapeshifter herself, able to trick the wolf, or already dead, serving as a grim warning about mortality. Her presence isn't comforting. It's a measure of stakes. You shiver and step back, observing how Little Red lifts the quilt. The wolf bares its teeth, not just a creature of instinct, but a mirror of human cunning, greed, and danger. The girl hesitates. You notice how every version of this tale emphasizes the choice: obey or disobey, trust or doubt. And yet, historically, those choices were rarely without consequence. Historians still argue whether these stories were specifically warnings to girls or metaphors for societal collapse. Some believe they were meant to teach children obedience and fear. Others suggest they were warnings to adults about their own moral failings. In any case, the darkness is deliberate. A soft wind rattles the windows, and you notice the trees sway as if whispering secrets. Little Red's eyes narrow, her basket shaking slightly. You can feel her heartbeat in your own chest. In early oral traditions, this story didn't end neatly. It echoed for generations, warning every child who listened that the world is often hungry, sometimes cruel, and never entirely safe. The wolf lunges, or maybe it's you imagining. Either way, you step away from the cottage, leaving the girl and her basket in a story that refuses to be sanitized. Outside, the forest waits, knowing another tale, the next girl, the next danger, is ready to unfold. The forest thickens as you follow a narrow, mud-slick path. Rain drips from the leaves onto your shoulders, cold and insistent. You stumble over roots and fallen branches, hearing a faint crunch behind you. It isn't the wolf this time. It's hunger. Europe, centuries ago, was hungry. And nowhere is that hunger more literal than in the story of Hansel and Gretel. You find the children near a worn path, pebbles in hand, dropping them carefully behind them. You remember that famous breadcrumb trail? But in truth, the story predates breadcrumbs. One mainstream historical fact. The original Grimm tale describes Hansel and Gretel as abandoned by starving parents during a famine so severe that cannibalism wasn't just a horror story, but a documented survival strategy in parts of medieval Europe. The story isn't exaggeration, it's warning. You probably won't survive this. The forest smells of wet soil and rotting leaves, and it presses close around you like a hungry animal. You watch as the children stumble upon a house made of bread, sugar, and candy. It seems whimsical until you remember. Candy wasn't a common treat in the Middle Ages. It was a luxury, a signal that the witch inside was rich, powerful, and predatory. She didn't need to hunt because her wealth was enough to trap souls. And the oven at the center of the house is no metaphor. It's a literal death sentence. Historians still argue whether this tale was originally about famine survival or moral instruction. Was the story meant to warn children about strangers, or to reflect the extreme hardships adults endured? Perhaps both. The witch herself is emblematic of society's dual fears: the abuse of women's power and the danger of unbridled greed. A quirky tidbit. In some versions, the witch is blind. She uses her nose instead of sight to find her prey, suggesting that evil doesn't need to see. It only needs to smell opportunity. The children's cleverness becomes a literal defense against sensory danger, not just abstract cleverness. You notice the siblings maneuvering in and out of the candy house. Hansel feigns ignorance while Gretel strategizes. Their survival isn't magic. It's wit, observation, and patience. In older oral traditions, the children's parents aren't villainous, they're desperate. In fact, famine forced decisions no moral compass could easily navigate. This story is a survival manual, disguised as a fairy tale. Another mainstream historical fact. The brothers Grimm collected Hansel and Gretel from folk tales that were centuries old, some dating back to 14th century Germany, when climate change and crop failures led to widespread hunger. Villagers actually did abandon children in forests, though rarely with fairy tale precision. Tales exaggerate for drama, but reality was grim enough. You crouch near the candy house and watch Gretel push the witch into the oven. You almost flinch. Another layer emerges. In the oral versions, Gretel's cleverness and bravery are the focal point. Hansel isn't the savior. He's a participant. The story subverts the typical gender norms, even if later tellings soften it. Historians still argue whether the story celebrates children's agency or merely depicts the consequences of poverty. A quirky detail. In some regional variants, the oven itself is enchanted, and children must perform clever tricks to avoid being burned. The danger isn't just physical. It's intellectual, ethical, and social. Survival required thinking, not strength. You step back and realize the lesson is stark. Sometimes the only way to survive is to fight the system, or at least the symbol of it. The forest, the witch, the abandoned children. They're not just characters. They're the embodiment of famine, desperation, and society's failure to protect its most vulnerable. As the rain thickens, you glance at the path ahead. Somewhere, another girl is about to enter the story, carrying bread in a basket, innocence in her eyes, and the shadows of the forest at her heels. You pull your coat tighter. Survival is rarely glamorous. The cold wind drifts through a palace courtyard, carrying the faint scent of roses and wax candles. You step carefully across the cobblestones, imagining the echo of courtiers' laughter and the rustle of silks. Ahead, a mirror gleams, too clear, too polished, reflecting a young woman brushing her hair while another watches jealously from the shadows. Snow White. You recognize her story. But you're about to see what the fancy illustrations usually hide. The mirror isn't just magic. One mainstream historical fact: mirrors were extremely rare and expensive in medieval and Renaissance Europe, symbols of power and vanity. For the fairest of them all to be so obsessed with her reflection wasn't superficial. It was an indictment of the social importance of appearance, age, and status in a patriarchal court. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting roses and singing birds only. You watch the jealous queen, her fingers tight around a poisoned apple. In the earliest known versions collected by the brothers Grimm, the queen orders Snow White's death, not because she wants her for herself, but because envy can kill, literally. The story reflects societal fear of female rivalry and the deadly consequences of vanity. Historians still argue whether this tale warns against personal vanity or the systemic oppression of women competing within restrictive hierarchies. A quirky tidbit: in some Scandinavian versions, the queen uses a bodice lace to strangle Snow White, or a poisoned comb rather than an apple. The object changes, but the moral remains: the pursuit of beauty can be lethal. The fairy tale becomes a handbook for surviving envy, manipulation, and hierarchical cruelty. You notice the dwarf's cottage tucked into the edge of the forest. Their labor, mining, cutting, crafting, is backgrounded, almost invisible, yet they're essential. The story emphasizes that life-saving shelter often comes from the periphery, not the center of society. It's a subtle nod to the idea that help often arises in unexpected places, but the threat remains ever present. Another mainstream historical fact: Grimm's Schneewittchen depicts Snow White as a girl of noble birth, reflecting Europe's obsession with class. Beauty, youth, and virtue were markers of social value, and in reality, courts often valued appearance over ability. A peasant girl rarely got rescued. She survived by cunning or anonymity. You lean closer to the glass. Snow White's lips are red, her cheeks pale, her hands folded neatly. It's staged perfection, the kind that draws the eyes of jealous queens. The queen's envy isn't mere spite. It's a reflection of a society that pits women against each other, framing them as rivals rather than individuals. A quirky tidbit: in early oral versions, the queen's voice sometimes comes from a demon or spirit inhabiting her body, suggesting that evil is externalized and otherworldly. Some scholars think this reflects the fear of witchcraft or social influence, jealousy as contagion, morality as infection. The poisoned apple gleams under torchlight. You realize Snow White's passivity, lying in a glass coffin, waiting, mirrors societal expectations. Beauty and compliance are rewarded. Agency is dangerous. The dwarf's intervention softens this, but only barely. Historians still argue whether the story criticizes these expectations or merely enforces them. You glance outside at the garden. It's beautiful, but the soil is heavy with death and despair. The birds flit through trees as if they know the stakes. You step back, feeling the tension. Snow White's sleep isn't restful. It's suspended mortality. Every fairy tale ending that seems cheerful is actually a compressed warning about envy, hierarchy, and mortality. The queen hisses through the keyhole, the fairest of them all. You realize the story is about power as much as beauty. Death, deceit, and envy are the tools of survival when your worth is measured by your reflection. The apple is more than poison. It's a metaphor for societal judgment, irresistible and deadly. You step into the shadows, leaving the princess under the glass coffin. The dwarfs are whispering, the birds are watching, and somewhere, The mirror's surface gleams, hungry for the next tale. Outside, the forest is alive with stories waiting to be told, and you can almost hear the distant laughter of the one who waits in the thicket. The girl in the red hood, still carrying bread, still walking toward danger. You glide down a long, echoing corridor of a grand castle, your footsteps muffled on the thick rugs. The air smells of perfumed candles, polished wood, and faint decay. Somewhere ahead, a young woman sits in a gilded chair, reading a book by lamplight. Across the hall, a man in a tailored suit watches her, patient and calculating. This is beauty, and this is the beast. But you're not entering a storybook romance. You're stepping into a labyrinth of social codes, emotional captivity, and the quiet terror of domestic expectation. In the earliest version, Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve's 1740 La Belle et la Bête, the tale is long, elaborate, and deeply unsettling. One mainstream historical fact: Villeneuve wrote her story for adult readers, not children, embedding commentary on arranged marriages, class, and the perils of beauty and obedience. The beast isn't just a monster. He's a metaphor for patriarchal power, wealth, and emotional dominance. You probably won't survive this if you think it's all roses and dancing. You move closer and see Beauty's hands folded in her lap. Her face is pale, lips tight with restraint. She is bound by etiquette, duty, and fear. The beast represents the control society exerts over women. Wealth can imprison just as easily as poverty, and marriage can feel like captivity even in gilded cages. Historians still argue whether the story encourages submission or critiques it. Perhaps Villeneuve intended both, wrapped in layers of enchantment. A quirky tidbit: in some early French versions, the beast is actually a lion, terrifying in size and behavior, and Beauty's courage and intelligence are tested through intricate moral riddles. The story becomes less about romantic love and more about navigating power dynamics, strategy, and intellect under duress. The castle itself is another character, vast, ornate, but cold and silent. Beauty walks its halls, touching nothing, fearing misstep, weighed down by expectation. You notice how every door seems heavy, every corridor endless. The story is less about enchantment and more about training. Survival requires emotional literacy, patience, and the constant awareness of unseen eyes. Another mainstream historical fact: in Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont's 1756 abridged version, the tale was edited for children, emphasizing love over strategy, obedience over negotiation. Disney followed this simplification centuries later. What was once a cautionary narrative about navigating power became a sanitized romance. You hear a faint growl from behind a velvet curtain. The beast emerges, not violent at first, but a constant reminder of the stakes. In older versions, he punishes disobedience subtly but relentlessly. Rooms locked, meals withheld, emotional isolation. Love is never freely given. It's earned under scrutiny. Historians still debate whether this is a critique of societal hierarchies or a reflection of them. A quirky detail: in some French oral versions, Beauty is allowed to visit her family only under strict surveillance. The narrative frames familial ties as both comfort and risk, emphasizing the tension between personal desire and societal obligation. You watch as Beauty makes small choices: what to eat, what to wear, what to say. Every gesture is a negotiation. The beast's gaze follows her constantly, not just as an individual, but as a representative of a system that rewards compliance and punishes deviation. You realize that this tale, like Cinderella, is a manual for navigating power disguised as romance. The night deepens. You stand in the hallway, watching the flicker of candlelight on gilded walls. The beast retreats into shadow, and beauty pauses by the window. Outside, the forest is silent, but expectant. You sense another story waiting, one submerged beneath water, salt, and sacrifice. The echo of the castle doors closing behind you feels final, but the moral remains. Sometimes love is less a choice than an obligation, and survival requires more than charm. It requires strategy, patience, and the ability to endure quiet terror without breaking. You find yourself at the edge of a vast ocean, the air thick with salt and the distant cries of gulls. The sky is bruised purple, and waves crash rhythmically against jagged rocks. There's a small figure perched on a cliff, her hair streaming like liquid gold behind her. She's humming a song you almost recognize. This is the Little Mermaid, but don't let the animation fool you. Her story is not about bubbly romance and undersea friends. It's about sacrifice, obsession, and a world that doesn't reward courage in the ways you expect. Hans Christian Andersen's 1837 tale is the version most modern audiences know. But one mainstream historical fact is that it was written for adults, not children. It was a meditation on unrequited love, spiritual longing, and the cost of transformation. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting a simple, happy ending. The Little Mermaid trades her voice for legs, a superficial bargain, but one that costs her far more. In Andersen's original, she cannot speak, cannot claim her identity, and suffers immense physical pain every step she takes on land. The romance isn't reciprocated in the way a conventional story promises. Historians still argue whether Andersen intended this as moral instruction, religious allegory, or a reflection of his own personal heartbreaks. Perhaps all three. A quirky tidbit. In some Nordic folklore, mermaids were actually dangerous omens. They lured sailors to their deaths with song, their beauty a trap. Andersen's story retains some of that danger. The mermaid is curious, brave, and ultimately doomed. The ocean is not a playground. It is a realm of risk, and the surface world above is equally treacherous. You see her standing on the rock's edge, the foam lapping at her ankles. Her gaze stretches toward a distant castle, toward a prince who barely notices her existence. Every graceful movement is an act of endurance, pain disguised as elegance. And yet, the story insists on the stakes, moral, spiritual, and corporeal. She is punished not for ambition, but for love itself. Another mainstream historical fact. The ending of Andersen's tale diverges sharply from later adaptations. The mermaid does not marry the prince. She dissolves into sea foam, given the opportunity to earn a soul through good deeds over centuries. Andersen originally subtitled his story A Little Mermaid's Soul, emphasizing spiritual striving over earthly reward. You step closer, imagining the agony of each step. With every stride, her legs burn as if she's walking on knives. You flinch, but she continues, because survival demands endurance, even when the world offers no comfort. The price of curiosity, courage, and desire is measured in unrelenting pain. A quirky tidbit. In some Danish variants, mermaids' tears turn into pearls, symbolizing both beauty and suffering. Andersen's tale embeds this metaphor. Her loss, her pain, her devotion become aestheticized as something almost divine. Beauty emerges from suffering, not happiness. Historians still argue whether the tale's message is nihilistic, spiritual, or feminist. Some scholars argue the mermaid represents Andersen's own constrained position as an unmarried woman's dependent, using her suffering as moral and social commentary. Others read it as a warning against sacrificing one's voice for love or status. Either way, it's a story that refuses to sugarcoat sacrifice. You glance toward the waves below. They churn, endless and indifferent. Survival here is about endurance, cunning, and quiet despair, traits rarely celebrated in sanitized adaptations. The prince smiles, unaware. The mermaid smiles anyway, a gesture of courage in a world that neither rewards nor notices. The cliff trembles under the rhythm of the tide, and you take a deep breath, imagining what it truly means to trade your voice, your body, your agency for someone else's affection. Andersen's Little Mermaid is a story that lingers, bitter and beautiful, warning anyone who listens that some sacrifices cannot be undone, no matter how magical the world appears. The wind carries the scent of salt and lost opportunity. You step back from the cliff, watching the foam swirl. Somewhere, another story waits. Less obvious, more whispered, steeped in smoke and shadows, with lessons about cunning, greed, and power disguised as domesticity. You follow a narrow, winding street into the heart of a village, cobblestones slick from a recent rain. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, carrying the scent of roasting meat and wood smoke. In the corner of a modest kitchen, a girl kneels by a well, her hands raw from scrubbing pots, her eyes bright with defiance. Rapunzel. She isn't swinging in a tower for whimsy, she's trapped, and the hair that fascinates the world is her only lifeline. One mainstream historical fact: the Grimm brothers recorded Rapunzel in Kinder- und Hausmärchen in 1812, but the tale originates in 16th century Italy and Germany, where girls were often locked away to protect their virtue or the family's honor. It's a story about control, surveillance, and the commodification of female beauty. You probably won't survive this if you think hair alone can save you. The tower isn't whimsical. It's a cage, vertical and unyielding. Rapunzel climbs or descends at the behest of others. She has agency, yes, but only within strict limitations imposed by her captor, and later by the prince. Historians still argue whether her story celebrates ingenuity or exposes the consequences of patriarchal restriction. Either way, it is less about liberation than negotiation. A quirky tidbit: in some early European versions, Rapunzel's hair isn't golden. It's long and black, or sometimes braided with herbs believed to ward off evil spirits. Her hair's color and length symbolize both protection and vulnerability, weaving superstition into the narrative. You see her winding braid through the window's ledge, waiting for the prince, who appears as a shadow at the forest's edge. In the older oral tales, he doesn't simply climb to rescue her. He must coax her, convince her, and often fails several times. The story is less a romance and more an endurance test. Can she trust? And can he persist without abusing his power? Another mainstream historical fact: in earlier versions, Rapunzel bears children in secret while still imprisoned, and the witch discovers her through betrayal. These details were edited out for children's versions, making the story cleaner and more palatable. Historians still debate whether the Grimm brothers softened these elements to protect child readers or to conform to bourgeois morality. The kitchen smells of cabbage and bread, ordinary domesticity masking extraordinary tension. You notice how Rapunzel's environment, the locked tower, the limited furnishings, the isolation, is designed to condition her. It's a psychological cage, not just a physical one. Her hair is the only bridge to the outside world, a thin tether that represents both freedom and danger. A quirky tidbit: in some oral traditions, the witch warns Rapunzel that her hair is sacred and should never touch the ground, or misfortune will follow. The hair becomes a symbol of responsibility, control, and ritualized obedience, her femininity bound to supernatural consequence. You hear the prince whisper through the window. He doesn't demand, he negotiates. In earlier versions, Rapunzel's cooperation is earned, not automatic. Trust is currency. Survival requires strategy, awareness, and emotional intelligence. Historians still argue whether Rapunzel represents submission or subtle resistance, the line blurring between obedience and cunning. Outside, the sun sets behind jagged hills, casting long shadows through the forest. You realize the story's darkness isn't just confinement, it's observation, manipulation, and societal control compressed into a simple narrative of hair and towers. Every generation has rewritten it, softening the cage into a story of romance, but the original tension lingers like smoke. You step back from the window, feeling the cold stone beneath your hand. Rapunzel's braid sways gently in the evening breeze, carrying with it the weight of centuries. You hear distant voices, another girl walking through the woods, basket in hand, eyes alert, stories of wolves and witches buzzing around her head. Survival in these tales isn't magic. It's cunning, courage, and an understanding of the world's cruelty. You leave the village behind and step into a moonlit meadow. Dew glistens on the grass, and the air smells of wild flowers and damp earth. A girl moves through the field, carrying a basket of food and a determined expression. She is none other than Goldilocks. But don't mistake her for the innocent wanderer from children's books. This story, too, hides a darker, more unsettling reality. One mainstream historical fact. The earliest printed version of Goldilocks was by Robert Southey in 1837, but oral versions exist far earlier. Originally, the story involved an old woman's house, not bears. Children were warned about intrusion, theft, and the consequences of curiosity. You probably won't survive this if you think it's just about porridge and nap time. You watch as she steps carefully through the forest, the trees whispering behind her. Her actions seem mischievous, but they are instructive. The tale warns about boundaries, respect, and the hidden dangers of unbridled curiosity. Historians still argue whether Goldilocks is a metaphor for social trespass or simply a morality tale for young girls learning to navigate property and privacy. A quirky tidbit. In some early versions, the bears are actually ogres or trolls, dangerous humans disguised as animals. The moral becomes less about taste and more about survival, knowing who or what can harm you when you cross into forbidden territory. You peek into the cottage. 3 beds, 3 chairs, 3 bowls of porridge. Goldilocks tries each, experiencing discomfort and satisfaction in turn. The narrative emphasizes choice, testing, and the consequences of actions. In older tales, she doesn't escape unscathed. Sometimes she is discovered and punished. Sometimes she flees, learning a bitter lesson about hubris and presumption. Another mainstream historical fact. Southey's version emphasized the bear family as gentle and forgiving, likely sanitizing the harsher oral traditions. Scholars suggest this reflects a broader 19th century trend to moralize and domesticize stories, turning cautionary warnings into gentle entertainment. You notice the forest beyond the cottage. It's dense, alive, and alert. In pre-modern Europe, forests were genuinely dangerous, home to wild animals, criminals, and unknown hazards. Children's stories often encoded practical survival lessons within fanciful narratives. Goldilocks teaches you not to wander blindly, not to overreach, and to respect the sanctity of others' homes. A quirky tidbit. In some versions, the bear's sizes are symbolic rather than literal, representing the family hierarchy or social order. The just right motif teaches discernment and judgment, skills crucial for navigating both domestic and social worlds. You step outside as Goldilocks flees, realizing the cottage's doors close behind her not because of narrative closure, but because boundaries are enforced. In this story, survival is less about innocence and more about learning to read signs, respecting limits, and understanding consequences before they bite or claw. Historians still argue whether the tale critiques curiosity or simply rewards prudence. Either way, you sense the forest's watchful presence, the lessons embedded in the landscape, and the tension underlying every seemingly innocent decision. Goldilocks is less a spoiled child and more a student of the hidden curriculum of life. The forest teaches, and it punishes those who forget to learn. The night air is thick and quiet now. You move on, leaving the cottage behind, the bear family's shadows lingering in your mind. Somewhere farther down the path, another girl waits. Her basket, her courage, her awareness sharpened by lessons old as the forest itself. You push through a thicket of trees and find yourself on a misty riverbank. The water reflects a pale, trembling moon. A girl kneels at the edge, her hands wet and trembling as she combs her hair with a golden brush. Rapunzel may have taught you about captivity, but this girl, call her Thumbelina, is smaller than your thumb, and her challenges are measured in inches, not feet. Yet her story is no gentler. One mainstream historical fact: Hans Christian Andersen first published Thumbelina in 1835, and like many of his tales, it was intended for adults as much as children. It explores vulnerability, danger, and the world's predatory tendencies. You probably won't survive this if you imagine a whimsical tale of tiny adventures. She is already in danger. Creatures loom. A toad plans to marry her for her size. A mole wants her underground, and birds flit above like untrustworthy guides. Andersen's narrative, far from sanitized, emphasizes the constant threat of exploitation and the consequences of physical and social fragility. Historians still argue whether these dangers were designed as moral instruction for children or reflections of adult anxieties about marriage, gender, and power. A quirky tidbit. In early Danish oral variants, Thumbelina could communicate with flowers and insects, suggesting that resourcefulness and connection to nature were her survival tools. Her smallness amplified vulnerability, but also demanded ingenuity. It's less about fairy magic than practical cunning. You watch her escape the toad's clutch, carried by a swallow across vast distances. Flight is literal and symbolic. Her survival requires speed, awareness, and the courage to act under extreme risk. In earlier oral traditions, she faces multiple near-death situations: drowning, predation, and manipulation. The story is relentless, emphasizing endurance over charm. Another mainstream historical fact: Andersen's ending is unusually optimistic for him. Thumbelina marries a fairy prince of her size. Yet the journey to that point is fraught with peril, loss, and near tragedy. Scholars still debate whether the happy ending was a concession to reader expectations or a subtle acknowledgement that even extreme vulnerability can sometimes yield agency. You notice how the world she moves through is vast, intimidating, and indifferent. Every creature is a potential threat, every river a boundary she must navigate. Survival is tactical, knowledge of the environment, careful timing, and alliances with unlikely helpers. Her story mirrors real societal pressures on small or powerless individuals, showing that cunning and resourcefulness are often their only protection. A quirky detail. In some Scandinavian oral versions, Thumbelina's movements leave tiny footprints visible only to observant humans, emphasizing attention to detail, stealth, and awareness. Her very presence teaches the audience to observe carefully, to notice dangers that loom unnoticed. The moonlight glances off her golden hair. She lifts her eyes to the sky, aware that flight is temporary, sanctuary fragile, and danger ever present. The story's tension is continuous. Smallness does not equal safety. Andersen's tale underscores that innocence and vulnerability demand extraordinary resilience. Historians still argue whether Thumbelina's narrative is primarily an allegory for women's societal marginalization or a broader meditation on human vulnerability. Either way, the lesson is sharp. Size, beauty, or cleverness alone do not protect you. Observation, courage, and endurance do. You step back from the riverbank, feeling the chill in your bones, imagining the challenges she has faced and those yet to come. The night is full of waiting stories, and somewhere in the distant forest, another girl prepares for her own trial, basket in hand, walking into danger with alert eyes. You continue along a winding path, the forest thinning to reveal a sunlit village. Children play, dogs bark, and smoke rises from chimneys, but your attention is drawn to a small house on the outskirts. Inside, a young girl kneads dough on a wooden table, humming softly. She's not baking for pleasure. She's preparing her fate. This is Hansel and Gretel's forgotten counterpart. A girl who survives not by luck, magic, or intervention, but by cunning, observation, and quick thinking. One mainstream historical fact: many oral versions of Hansel and Gretel were told in famine-stricken regions of Germany between the 14th and 16th centuries, reflecting real societal anxieties about scarcity and survival. Parents abandoning children during famines was rare but documented. You probably won't survive this if you imagine a neat rescue or sugar-dusted endings. The girl pauses, listening for movement. Her survival requires awareness of subtle signs: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, even the faint odor of smoke from a distant fire. In older tales, children often had to fend for themselves after abandonment, highlighting practical survival skills disguised as storybook adventures. Historians still argue whether these narratives were primarily morality tales for children or veiled commentaries on societal neglect. A quirky tidbit: some early German versions describe the children marking their path with pebbles which glitter faintly in moonlight, a symbolic act emphasizing foresight and intelligence as tools for survival. It's not mere whimsy, it's the encoding of life lessons for attentive minds. You watch as the girl spies a nearby cottage made of food. Unlike Goldilocks or the Grimm siblings, she evaluates it cautiously, testing the structure, the smells, even the faint footprints around it. The moral isn't about temptation. It's about preparation and vigilance. The forest is full of stories warning that curiosity without caution can be fatal. Another mainstream historical fact: the brothers Grimm edited the tale extensively, softening the violence and giving children a happy ending. In oral traditions, the children sometimes perished, were enslaved, or survived only through repeated cleverness. Survival was never guaranteed. It required constant effort, insight, and resilience. You notice the forest beyond the cottage. Shadows flicker, and the wind whispers through the trees. This is a story about the environment as antagonist. It tests, teaches, and punishes. A small misstep, a wrong turn, a discarded breadcrumb can mean death. The landscape itself is a character, as unforgiving as any witch or wolf. A quirky detail: in some variants, the witch is symbolic rather than literal. She represents famine, predation, or societal failure, an abstract danger given flesh for storytelling purposes. Survival depends on reading threats accurately, not just reacting instinctively. The girl gathers resources, sets clever traps, and moves with intent. Her success is measured not in moral virtue, but in intelligence and adaptability. Historians still debate whether these tales were designed to instill obedience or to encourage children to think independently under duress. You step back, watching her disappear into the forest. Her footsteps vanish, but the lesson lingers. Life is harsh, threats are constant, and cleverness is as vital as courage. In this story, survival is a skill, not a reward. The village fades behind you, and you realize another story waits. A tale of danger, cunning, and moral complexity, hidden in familiar faces and ordinary places, ready to challenge expectations. You move into a dense grove where the fog hangs low, curling around gnarled trunks like phantom fingers. A girl steps cautiously along a narrow path, clutching a tiny lamp. Her name is often whispered as Briar Rose or Aurora. But the story you're about to witness is not about the prince's kiss. It's about time, powerlessness, and the lurking consequences of fate ignored. One mainstream historical fact: the tale of Sleeping Beauty, in Perrault's 1697 version, includes the famous spindle prick. But early oral traditions often featured curses from offended fairies or witches, reflecting societal fear of female authority and vengeance. You probably won't survive this if you think a simple kiss can undo centuries of misfortune. The castle is silent, overgrown with thorns, as if nature itself conspires to contain the danger. The girl walks carefully, aware that the world can strike without warning, that a moment of inattention can last decades. In older versions, the curse was rarely lifted by love. It demanded endurance, patience, and the right timing. Historians still argue whether these tales teach submission to destiny or resilience against it. A quirky tidbit: in some Italian and German variants, the heroine's family is warned repeatedly by mystical beings, but they ignore the advice. The spindle is a simple object, yet it embodies societal oversight, carelessness, and the consequences of ignoring wisdom. The story is less about magic, more about the interplay between human error and inevitability. You notice the thorn-covered castle glimmer faintly under the moonlight. The thorns aren't just obstacles. They are guardians, testing resolve and attention. The girl moves slowly, understanding that curiosity without caution can be deadly. Every step is deliberate, every breath measured. Survival is vigilance wrapped in patience. Another mainstream historical fact: the Grimm's version added the detail of the princess awakening after 100 years, often with no explanation of biological reality. This narrative compression masks centuries of hardship, waiting, and potential danger that the original oral tales implied, spanning famine, political upheaval, and disease. You spot the spindle hidden among dust and cobwebs. The warning signs are clear, yet human frailty is emphasized. Carelessness or desire leads to catastrophe. This is a repeated motif across dark bedtime stories. The blend of curiosity, impatience, and social naivety can have permanent consequences. A quirky detail: in some folklore, the princess can hear the ticking of time as a faint pulse in her veins, a metaphor for both mortality and the invisible pressures imposed by society. Sleeping isn't peaceful. It's suspended danger, awareness deferred. Historians still debate whether the tale's focus on beauty, sleep, and male rescue reinforces patriarchal norms or subtly critiques them by emphasizing the heroine's passive endurance. Either way, the narrative encodes a lesson. Even when everything seems under control, external forces, time, society, fate, remain indifferent. You step away from the castle's edge, feeling the oppressive weight of the centuries-long slumber. The forest is quiet but vigilant, brambles twisting and curling like sentinels. Beyond lies the path of the next story, where cunning, courage, and awareness will again be tested. Another girl, another lesson hidden beneath the guise of a fairy tale. You step into a twilight garden, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the faint rustle of unseen creatures. A young girl carries a basket of apples, her shoes scuffed, her eyes wide with caution. This is Snow White revisited, not the polished princess from picture books, but a figure navigating danger, envy, and societal expectation in its rawest form. Yet this time, her story overlaps with echoes of the other tales you've seen: the lurking wolves, the cunning witches, the perilous forests. The boundaries between innocence and experience blur. One mainstream historical fact: early oral versions of Snow White, including those recorded by the Grimms in the early 19th century, emphasized the deadly consequences of envy and social hierarchy. Beauty was power, and power drew attention and risk. You probably won't survive this if you expect the end to be neat or entirely cheerful. You watch her approach a window where a figure lies seemingly asleep. The queen's jealousy has been relentless, and Snow White's survival is contingent upon cunning, timing, and the interventions of others. Historians still argue whether this story primarily serves as a warning to young women about vanity and rivalry, or a reflection of social anxieties about inheritance, class, and female agency. A quirky tidbit: in some pre-Grimm versions, Snow White's mother dies in childbirth, and her father remarries a stepmother who is herself portrayed as a mystical, almost supernatural agent of envy. The story is then less about simple sibling or peer rivalry and more about complex familial and social politics. The danger is multi-layered: physical, social, and psychological. You notice the glass coffin, the transparent barrier between life and death, hope and despair. Snow White's sleep is not an absence of agency. It's suspended threat, a liminal state where survival hangs by a thread. The dwarfs, previously her protectors, are symbolic guardians, representing social and communal networks that sometimes intervene, but can't always shield individuals from systemic danger. Another mainstream historical fact: the Grimms later softened the tale's violence, adding the hunter, the escape, and the ultimate defeat of the queen. But oral traditions across Europe depict harsher realities, where mistakes, naivety, or misjudgment could result in permanent loss. Stories served as encoded survival guides, warning children and adults about the stakes of human interaction. You watch Snow White awaken, a moment that feels miraculous, yet is layered with tension. The prince's kiss, in early texts, was absent. Survival depended more on cleverness, timing, and the collapse of the queen's schemes than on romantic intervention. Historians still debate whether this narrative elevates female agency or ultimately reinforces patriarchal structures, but the danger remains palpable. A quirky detail: in some Germanic oral traditions, the apple is never fully consumed. It's a symbolic token of societal temptation, a lesson that threats often disguise themselves as ordinary objects. Danger often hides in plain sight, And awareness is crucial for survival. You step back from the coffin, feeling the residual tension in the forest air, the echoes of countless other stories, the girl in the red hood, Hansel and Gretel, Thumbelina, Rapunzel, interweaving and overlapping. Each tale carries lessons on observation, cunning, courage, and resilience. Each warns you that innocence alone is rarely enough. Survival requires awareness, strategy, and the willingness to act under pressure. The forest around you hums with distant whispers. You realize that all these dark truths, wolves, witches, thorns, curses, spindles, and poisoned apples, form a lattice of cautionary wisdom passed down through centuries. Each story a survival manual hidden in plain sight. And somewhere farther along the path, another girl, another narrative, waits to test the unwary. You exhale slowly, letting the tension of all those stories settle like dust in the corners of your mind. The forest, the castles, the cliffs and cottages fade into a gentle haze. The wind sighs through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and faint, lingering traces of magic. You feel the weight of all those lessons about courage, cunning, and careful observation soften into something calmer, almost comforting. The girls, the mermaids, the dwarfs, the wolves, they are no longer threats. They have become teachers whispering timeless guidance, each story a thread in a vast tapestry meant to prepare you for the world beyond the page. The air cools, your heartbeat slows, and you notice the subtle hum of life around you. Leaves rustling, distant water trickling, the occasional call of an owl. Even the shadows feel softer now, as if the forest itself is tucking you in. Danger may have lurked in each tale, but now it has been distilled into lessons you can carry without fear. You imagine the girls resting at last, Red Hood in her bed, Hansel and Gretel safe beyond the witch's oven, Snow White asleep but protected, Thumbelina drifting on gentle winds. Survival is no longer precarious. It's a quiet strength, a calm awareness cultivated through trials and stories. Every cautionary tale begins to feel like a lullaby. You trace the echoes of suspense, anxiety, and triumph in your mind, letting each narrative unwind gently. The poisoned apples, the spindle pricks, the lurking wolves, they are now gentle reminders, guiding you to notice the hidden dangers in life, to value vigilance, resourcefulness, and patience. You are not fearful. You are reflective, softly smiling at the cleverness, bravery, and resilience displayed by these timeless characters. As you settle deeper into this meditative state, the edges of the stories blur into the background, leaving only the sense of calm wisdom they impart. Your thoughts slow, your eyelids grow heavy, and the forest whispers lull you further. There is peace in the knowledge that danger can be understood, mitigated, and respected without surrendering to fear. You carry the lessons gently, like a lantern illuminating the dark, guiding you forward with quiet confidence. The hum of the night continues, soft and steady, as if the world itself is breathing with you. Shadows soften to gentle shapes, dangers dissolve into memory, and the cadence of the forest matches the rhythm of your own pulse. You are ready to rest, to dream, knowing that the dark truths of these stories have been transformed into gentle guardians of awareness, courage, and thoughtful action. The lessons are yours to keep, carried like a soft cloak, comforting and warm as sleep drifts closer.